December 12, 1943, Warsaw, Poland. Snow fell in gentle flakes outside the window of the Weiss Textiles factory, a small establishment that had somehow managed to continue operations despite the upheaval of the ongoing conflict. Inside, 27-year-old Esther Goldstein worked with nimble fingers, carefully stitching the final seam on a winter coat destined for a German officer. She believed she was simply following orders, fulfilling her role in a system that had conscripted her skills for the German war effort. Little did she know that the simple act of courage she was about to commit would set in motion events that would save dozens of lives and challenge the convictions of a man who thought he understood the world. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the extraordinary account of how a desperate message, hidden in the lining of a military coat, would transform not only the life of the woman who wrote it, but also the German soldier who discovered it, revealing how even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity can emerge in the most unexpected places and from the most unlikely individuals. Esther had been working at Weiss Textiles since 1938, long before the Germans arrived in Warsaw. The owner, Jakob Weiss, had employed 15 Jewish tailors and seamstresses, priding himself on creating the finest clothing in the district. When restrictions on Jewish businesses began, Jakob managed to keep his shop open by partnering with a Polish businessman named Marek Kowalski, who became the official owner on paper. By 1943, the factory had been repurposed to produce military uniforms and winter gear for German forces. Esther's fingers were red and chapped from the cold as she worked. The factory's heating had been minimal for months, with coal being diverted to more essential German operations. Still, the workers considered themselves fortunate. While many of their friends and family had been relocated to the ghetto or sent east on trains, they remained in the city proper, their skills deemed valuable enough to keep them employed. Lieutenant Colonel Werner Richter of the Wehrmacht's 154th Infantry Division examined the production manifests at his desk in the military procurement office. The winter had been brutal, with temperatures dropping far below what the German supply chain had anticipated. Reports from the Eastern Front indicated that cold weather gear was critically needed, with frostbite causing nearly as many casualties as enemy fire. "We need 300 additional winter coats by the end of January," Richter announced to his assistant, Corporal Meyer. "The Fuhrmann factory is already at capacity. What about that Polish place, Weiss, I believe?" Meyer consulted his records. "Weiss Textiles, sir. They've produced 78 coats for us in the past month. Quality work, no rejected items." Richter nodded, making a note in his ledger. "Increase their quota. I want to inspect their operation myself tomorrow. Arrange it." Richter was known among his peers for his meticulous attention to detail. At 42 years old, he had spent his entire adult life in military service, beginning his career during the previous conflict and rising steadily through the ranks. He came from a family with a long military tradition, his father having served as an officer in the Imperial German Army. His university education in engineering made him particularly valuable in logistics and supply management, allowing him to serve his country without being directly involved in combat operations. That evening, as the workers prepared to leave the factory, Marek Kowalski gathered them around. His face was grim. "I have received new orders," he announced, his voice low. "Our quota has been increased. We are to produce an additional 300 winter coats by the end of January." A murmur spread through the assembled workers. 300 coats in such a short time meant longer hours and more difficult conditions. "There is more," Kowalski continued. "Lieutenant Colonel Richter will be inspecting our operation tomorrow. Everything must be perfect. Any deficiencies will be severely punished." The workers dispersed with worried expressions. Esther walked with her friend Rachel Abramowitz, both women pulling their thin coats tightly around themselves against the biting wind. "How will we manage so many?" Rachel whispered. "We are already working from dawn until curfew." Esther shook her head. "We will find a way. We always do." As they approached the checkpoint that separated their assigned residential sector from the rest of the city, Rachel's voice dropped even lower. "Have you heard from your brother?" Esther tensed, but kept her face neutral as they showed their papers to the guards. "Nothing since August," she replied once they were past. Her brother David had fled to the countryside early in the occupation, joining groups of resistance fighters in the forests. His last message had come through a sympathetic Polish delivery man who no longer made rounds to their area. That night, in the small room she shared with two other women in a designated housing block, Esther made a decision. The increased production would mean more materials in the factory, more thread, more fabric, more paper for patterns, and more opportunities. The next morning, as Lieutenant Colonel Richter made his inspection of Weiss Textiles, Esther kept her eyes down, focusing on her work. The tall officer moved methodically through the facility, examining the quality of materials, the efficiency of the layout, and the skill of the workers. "The work here is satisfactory," Richter told Kowalski as they stood at the end of the production line. "I expect the new quota to be met without fail. The items produced here directly impact the effectiveness of our forces." After the inspection, as normal operations resumed, Esther carefully retrieved a small piece of paper she had hidden in her shoe. During her lunch break, when the supervisor was distracted, she quickly wrote a message in small, neat handwriting. "If you are reading this, please know that the person who made your coat is Esther Goldstein, a Jewish woman forced to work in Warsaw. My family has been taken east. I do not know if they live. There are 15 of us here working against our will. We are human beings. We wish only to live in peace." She folded the note into the smallest possible square, and when the opportunity presented itself that afternoon, slipped it into the lining of a nearly completed officer's coat, one of the finest pieces they had produced, with extra wool insulation and a fur-trimmed collar. She stitched the lining closed, her heart pounding so loudly she feared others would hear it. The act itself was over in seconds, but Esther knew the consequences would be dire if the note was discovered by the wrong person. She had just committed what would be considered sabotage, possibly even espionage. The punishment would not be merely her own dismissal or imprisonment, but likely retaliation against all the workers. Yet something in her had snapped that morning, watching the German officer inspect them as if they were machinery rather than people. It was not a grand act of resistance, but it was something, an assertion of her humanity, a reminder that the items passing through German hands had been made by people with names, histories, and families. 2 days later, the coat containing Esther's note was packed with a shipment of 30 similar items and transported to a distribution center in eastern Germany. From there, it was assigned to a unit heading to the Eastern Front, where the fighting against Soviet forces had intensified and the winter had grown even more bitter. Captain Friedrich Müller of the 267th Infantry Division received the coat as a replacement for his damaged one on January 9, 1944. At 34 years old, Müller had already seen more combat than most, having served since the early days of the conflict. The son of a doctor from Dresden, he had joined the military against his father's wishes, believing it his patriotic duty. 4 years of fighting had changed Friedrich Müller. The idealism that had driven him to enlist had been gradually eroded by the realities of warfare, by the endless suffering he had witnessed, and by growing doubts about the cause he was fighting for. These doubts he kept to himself, aware that expressing them could be considered treasonous. Müller discovered the note 3 days after receiving the coat, as he was searching the pockets for his cigarettes during a brief respite from duty. His fingers felt something unusual in the lining, a small, hard object near the lower seam. Curious, he used his pocket knife to carefully open a small section of the stitching and extracted the folded paper. As he read Esther's words, Müller felt a cold that had nothing to do with the Russian winter seep into his bones. He had heard rumors, of course, whispered stories of what was happening to Jewish populations in occupied territories, but like many, he had dismissed these as exaggerations or propaganda. Facing the handwritten note from a real person with a name, Esther Goldstein, made it impossible to maintain that comfortable disbelief. That night, unable to sleep in his temporary quarters, Müller reread the note by flashlight. He thought of the seamstress whose hands had crafted the coat, keeping him warm. He thought of his own sister back in Dresden, how she worked in a textile factory now, part of the domestic production effort. The parallels disturbed him deeply. Müller had witnessed the treatment of civilians in occupied territories, had seen the evacuations and relocations. But he had accepted the official explanations: security concerns, military necessity. The logistics of managing potential hostile populations, the simple humanity of Esther's note, cut through those abstractions. In that moment, he made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his life. He would find out the truth about what was happening, and if the rumors were accurate, he would no longer be complicit through inaction. The opportunity to act came sooner than he expected. 2 weeks later, Müller was reassigned to administrative duties in Warsaw after sustaining a minor injury during a skirmish. The transfer was considered temporary, a chance for him to recover while still contributing to the war effort by assisting with logistical coordination between various military departments. On his 3rd day in Warsaw, Müller requested permission to inspect several production facilities, providing supplies to the front, citing his recent combat experience as valuable for identifying which items were most effective in field conditions. His superior, Major Hoffmann, approved the request without much interest. "Take Sergeant Bauer with you," Hoffmann instructed, "and focus on winter gear. We're still losing too many men to the cold." And so on February 4, 1944, Captain Friedrich Müller walked into Weiss Textiles, the coat with Esther's note folded carefully in his bag. Marek Kowalski greeted the German officers with the appropriate deference, offering to show them the production process from start to finish. Müller scanned the workers as they moved through the facility. They all looked thin and tired, their movements efficient but strained. He wondered which one was Esther Goldstein. "These workers," Müller asked casually as they observed the cutting tables, "they are all Polish citizens?" Kowalski hesitated just slightly. "Yes, Captain. All registered properly with the Labor Office." Sergeant Bauer, a dedicated party member, gave Kowalski a sharp look. "The captain asked you a direct question. Answer fully." Kowalski swallowed. "They are skilled workers, sir. Some are of Jewish background, but their skills are essential to meeting production quotas." Müller nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "I see. The quality of the work is what matters most for our troops." He turned to Bauer. "Inspect the storage area. I want to know if they have sufficient materials for continued production." Once Bauer had left, Müller lowered his voice. "Mr. Kowalski, I need to speak with one of your workers. Privately. A woman named Esther Goldstein." The color drained from Kowalski's face. "Sir, This is not an accusation," Müller interrupted. "Nor is it an official inquiry, but it is important." Kowalski led Müller to a small office at the back of the facility. "Wait here, please," he said, his voice unsteady. Minutes later, the door opened, and a young woman entered. She was thin, but stood straight, her dark eyes meeting Müller's with a combination of fear and defiance. "You asked to see me, sir." Her voice was steady despite her obvious apprehension. Müller dismissed Kowalski with a gesture, then closed the door. Without speaking, he reached into his bag and removed the coat. He laid it on the desk between them, then carefully extracted the note from the lining and placed it beside the garment. Esther's face went pale, but she didn't flinch or look away. "I received this coat at the front," Müller said quietly. "I found your message." "Then I assume I am under arrest," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Müller shook his head slowly. "No. I came to talk to you, to ask you questions." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Is what you wrote true? About your family?" Something flickered in Esther's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or confusion. "Yes," she said after a moment. "My parents and younger sister were taken in June last year. The official statement was that they were being relocated for labor in the East." "And you have had no word from them since?" "No. Many families have been separated this way." Müller sat down heavily in the chair behind the desk, gesturing for Esther to take the seat opposite. She remained standing. "Why did you put this note in the coat?" he asked. "You must have known the risk." Esther's expression changed, a flash of that defiance returning. "Because I wanted whoever wore it to know that it was made by human hands, Jewish hands, that we are not the animals your propaganda claims we are." The bluntness of her response startled Müller. In that moment, he made another decision. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice low. "I believe you, and I have seen things, heard things. that suggest what is happening in the East is not merely relocation for labor. Esther's posture shifted slightly, the first hint of something beyond fear entering her expression. "I want to help," Müller continued. "Not just you, but the others here as well. But to do that, I need information, names, documentation, locations. Why would you help us?" Esther asked, suspicion evident in her tone. "You are a German officer." "I am also a human being," Müller replied simply, "and I can no longer pretend not to see what is happening." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Sergeant Bauer's voice came through clearly. "Captain, I've completed the inspection of the storage areas." "One moment," Müller called out. He quickly folded the note and slipped it into his pocket, then handed the coat to Esther. "Repair this seam," he said in a louder, more official tone, "and be more careful with your stitching in the future." Esther took the coat, her eyes still locked on Müller's face, searching for deception. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "The cafe across from St. Alexander's Church, 2 in the afternoon. Bring documentation for your workers, anything that might help establish non-Jewish identities." Esther gave a barely perceptible nod, then raised her voice. "Yes, Captain. I will repair it immediately." When Bauer entered, he found Müller standing at the desk, reviewing production figures, while a Jewish worker hurried away with a damaged coat. The next day, Esther debated whether to go to the meeting. It could be a trap, a test of her loyalty, or a cruel game. But something in the German officer's eyes had seemed genuine, a weariness, a humanity that had been absent in most of the occupiers she had encountered. She decided to take the risk. With forged papers hidden in the lining of her own coat, documentation that Kowalski had been quietly preparing for months in case evacuation became necessary, she made her way to the cafe. She half expected to be arrested the moment she arrived, but instead found Müller sitting alone at a corner table dressed in civilian clothes. Over the next hour, they formulated a plan. Müller's position in administrative logistics gave him access to transportation manifests, identity records, and military movement schedules. With this information, combined with Kowalski's connections to Polish resistance networks, they could potentially create a path for the workers at Weiss Textiles to escape Warsaw before the next round of relocations that Müller had learned were being planned. "Why are you really doing this?" Esther asked as their meeting drew to a close. "You are risking everything." Müller was silent for a long moment. "I joined the military to serve my country, to protect my homeland. What I've seen, what we're doing in occupied territories, this is not protection. This is not the Germany I thought I was fighting for." Their plan took shape over subsequent clandestine meetings. Kowalski would gradually replace the Jewish workers at the factory with Poles, a few at a time to avoid suspicion, while Müller would arrange for the necessary papers and transportation for those being replaced to reach safer locations. The first to leave were Rachel Abramovitz and her elderly father, who had been hidden in their apartment for months. Müller arranged for them to be included in a transport of Polish laborers being sent to work at a farm in southern Germany, where a resistance contact would help them cross into Switzerland. The operation was not without close calls. In early March, a surprise inspection by SS officers nearly revealed the deception. Müller had to quickly intervene, claiming the inspection interfered with a military intelligence operation. His rank and confidence were enough to deter the SS officers, but he knew such tactics would not work indefinitely. By April, 7 of the 15 Jewish workers had been successfully relocated. Esther remained, coordinating from inside the factory, while her relationship with Müller evolved from cautious cooperation to mutual respect and, eventually, to something deeper that neither of them acknowledged directly. Major Hoffmann began to grow suspicious of Müller's frequent visits to Weiss Textiles and his unusual interest in labor allocation. He assigned Sergeant Bauer to monitor Müller's activities more closely. "The captain seems particularly concerned with production efficiency," Bauer reported after following Müller for 3 days, but he spends an unusual amount of time in conversation with the Polish manager and some of the workers. Hoffmann frowned. "Captain Müller has an exemplary record, but his injury may have affected him more than we realized. Perhaps he has grown too sympathetic to the local population. Should I report him to security services? Bauer asked, eager to demonstrate his diligence. Not yet, Hoffman decided, but increase your surveillance and arrange for me to make an unannounced visit to this factory. On April 23rd, as Esther was preparing documentation for the next group of workers to be relocated, Marek Kowalski burst into the back room, his face ashen. Major Hoffman is here with Sergeant Bauer and 2 security officers, he whispered urgently. They're asking to see the employee records. Esther quickly gathered the papers she had been working on and hid them inside a hollow space beneath the floorboards that they had created for precisely this purpose. How much time do we have? Minutes at most. They're inspecting the main floor now. Esther's mind raced. The employee records would reveal discrepancies. Workers who were supposedly still employed but had actually been relocated. Identification numbers that wouldn't match official records. Tell them there was a small fire last week, she instructed. Say it damaged some of the records and you've requested replacements from the administrative office but haven't received them yet. Kowalski nodded and hurried back to intercept the German officers. Esther used the moment to send a young Polish worker, Tomasz, out the back door with a message for Müller. The boy slipped away just as the sound of boots approached the office area. Major Hoffman was an imposing figure, tall and lean with cold grey eyes that seemed to dissect everything they observed. He entered the record room with Bauer and the 2 security officers close behind. "Ah, another worker," he remarked upon seeing Esther. "Continue your duties." Esther kept her eyes lowered and moved to leave, but one of the security officers blocked her path. "Your papers," he demanded, hand extended. With outwardly calm movements that belied her racing heart, Esther produced her identification card, a forgery that Müller had provided, identifying her as Helena Nowak, a Polish Catholic from Krakow. The officer examined the card carefully, then looked at her face, comparing it to the photograph. A tense moment passed before he handed it back with a nod. "Mr. Kowalski informs me that some of your employment records were damaged," Hoffman said once Esther had left. "A convenient explanation for why your workforce doesn't match the official registry." "It is unfortunate timing, sir," Kowalski replied, maintaining his composure, "but we have already requested replacement documentation. Captain Müller was assisting us with expediting the process, given the importance of maintaining production." "Captain Müller seems to assist you with many things," Hoffman observed coldly. "He will be joining us shortly. Sergeant Bauer has sent for him." The implications were clear. Somehow, they had become suspicious of Müller's activities. Esther, listening from just outside the door, felt a cold dread settle over her. Their entire operation was in jeopardy. Captain Müller arrived 30 minutes later, having received Tomasz's warning just moments before Bauer's official summons. He had used the time to prepare, bringing with him a folder of documents from headquarters. "Major Hoffman," Müller greeted his superior with a salute. "I understand you're conducting an inspection of the facility." Hoffman regarded him with narrowed eyes. "An unscheduled inspection, Captain. Yet somehow you seem unsurprised to find me here." "I was already on my way, sir," Müller replied smoothly. "There were discrepancies in the production reports that required my attention." "Discrepancies seem to be a common occurrence at this establishment," Hoffman remarked. "Missing records? Workers whose identities don't quite align with official registries." Müller maintained his composure. "Which is precisely why I've been monitoring the situation closely, sir. In fact, I've been conducting a quiet investigation under the authority of General Keller." This name-dropping was a calculated risk. General Keller was the regional commander, known for his strict adherence to procedure, but also for his distrust of the SS and security services, encroaching on military matters. Müller opened his folder and produced an official-looking document bearing the general's signature, a forgery he had prepared months earlier for just such a contingency. There have been suspicions of black market activity involving military supplies from several production facilities in the area, Müller explained. General Keller authorized me to investigate without alerting potential collaborators, which is why I've been operating with limited disclosure. Hoffman examined the document, his expression unreadable. "This is the first I'm hearing of such an investigation." "Operational security, sir," Müller responded. The general was explicit about minimizing the number of individuals aware of the operation. A tense silence filled the room as Hoffman considered this explanation. Finally, he handed the document back to Müller. "I will be speaking with General Keller directly about this matter," he stated. "In the meantime, you will provide me with complete reports on all your activities related to this investigation by tomorrow morning." "Of course, sir," Müller agreed, knowing that this reprieve was temporary at best. Once Hoffman spoke with General Keller, the deception would be exposed. After the German officers departed, Müller, Esther, and Kowalski gathered in the back office. "We have 24 hours at most," Müller said grimly. "Once Hoffman speaks with Keller, they'll return with security forces." "Then we move tonight," Esther decided. "The remaining workers, all of them." Kowalski looked alarmed. "That's 8 people plus you. We don't have transportation arranged for so many at once." "We do now," Müller interjected, pulling a set of official orders from his pocket. "Transport requisition for 9 civilian specialists to be moved to a production facility in Zurich. The signatures are genuine. I've been saving these forms for an emergency." "And you?" Esther asked quietly. "What will happen to you once the deception is discovered?" Müller's expression was resolute. "I'll report to Hoffman in the morning with incomplete documentation, buying you more time to get across the border. After that," he shrugged, "I'll make my way south if I can." That night, as darkness fell over Warsaw, a military truck arrived at the service entrance of Weiss Textiles. The remaining Jewish workers, along with Kowalski, who had decided it was too dangerous to remain behind, boarded the vehicle with only what they could carry in small bags. Esther was the last to board, pausing to look at Müller, who stood beside the driver's seat in his uniform. "This isn't goodbye," he told her quietly. "I'll find you when this is over." "How?" she asked. He pressed something into her hand, a small worn photograph of a house with a distinctive red door. "My family's summer home in Bavaria. It's remote, abandoned now. I'll meet you there when I can." The journey that followed tested the limits of their courage and resourcefulness. Müller drove through the night, using his authority to pass through checkpoints with minimal scrutiny. By dawn, they had reached the German border, where Müller had arranged for a sympathetic border officer to be on duty. "These workers are being transferred to the Daimler facility in Stuttgart," Müller informed the officer, presenting the forged transportation orders. "Priority production for new tank components." The border guard examined the papers, then looked at the tired faces in the back of the truck. If he noticed anything unusual, he gave no indication. "Everything appears to be in order, Captain. Safe travels." Once they had crossed into Germany, Müller drove to a small village where resistance contacts were waiting with civilian clothes and new identification papers for everyone. Here the group would split up, some heading toward Switzerland, others to safe houses in southern Germany, where they would wait out the remainder of the conflict. For Esther, the plan was to continue to the Bavarian safe house that Müller had told her about, where she would wait for him to join her when he could escape. Their parting was brief and restrained, both aware of the watching eyes around them. "You have saved more than just lives," Esther told him, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "You have saved faith in humanity itself." Müller touched her hand briefly. "It was your courage that began this, a note in a coat that made it impossible for me to look away. Remember that." Back in Warsaw, as expected, Major Hoffman discovered the deception when he contacted General Keller. By the time security forces arrived at Weiss Textiles, they found an empty facility and a typewritten note on Müller's desk. "I can no longer participate in what history will judge as unconscionable. My conscience dictates that I act according to human principles rather than orders that violate them." The manhunt that followed was extensive, but ultimately unsuccessful. Müller had planned his escape meticulously, using his knowledge of military procedures and checkpoints to stay ahead of his pursuers. He made his way south through occupied territories, aided by resistance networks, grateful for the information he provided about German troop movements. The journey took months, with many close calls and moments when capture seemed imminent. By the time he reached the Bavarian safe house in November 1944, the tide of the conflict had shifted dramatically, with German forces retreating on multiple fronts. Esther was there, as they had planned, having established herself in the local community as a war widow. Their reunion was one of quiet joy and shared purpose, as they worked together to help other refugees making their way through the underground network they had become part of. After the end of the conflict, when the full extent of what had happened in the East became known, Müller's actions were recognized by witnesses who had survived thanks to his intervention. While many former German officers were facing charges for their roles in the conflict, Müller's case was different. Testimonies from those he had saved, including documentation of his resistance activities, led to his exemption from prosecution. Esther and Friedrich married in 1947, settling eventually in Switzerland, where they helped establish an organization dedicated to reuniting families separated during the conflict. The coat that had started their journey hung framed on their wall, a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage can have profound consequences. In the decades that followed, they would often share their story with younger generations, emphasizing not the darkness of the era they had lived through, but the light that individual choices could bring to even the bleakest circumstances. The most important lesson, Esther would tell those who listened, is that systems of hatred can be powerful, but they are never stronger than the human capacity for compassion. Every person who stands against cruelty, no matter how small their action might seem, weakens the foundations of that system. Friedrich would add, "And remember that people can change." The uniform I wore did not define me, just as the labels others placed on Esther did not define her. We are defined by our choices, especially those we make when the cost of doing right is highest. Their story became known beyond their immediate circle after a journalist interviewed them for an article about rescue efforts during the conflict. The article, published in 1967, caught the attention of historians documenting acts of resistance and moral courage. Kowalski, who had established a new textile business in America after the conflict, maintained correspondence with Esther and Friedrich throughout his life. The network of people whose lives had been touched by their actions expanded over the years, as those they had saved went on to have families of their own. In 1983, 40 years after Esther slipped her note into the lining of a coat, she and Friedrich returned to Warsaw for the first time since the conflict. The city had been rebuilt, transformed, yet places remained that held memories both painful and profound. The building that had housed Weiss Textiles was now an apartment complex, with no physical marker of what had once occurred there. Yet, as they stood across the street looking up at the windows where the sewing machines had once hummed, both felt the weight of history and the power of the choices they had made. "If I hadn't put that note in your coat," Esther mused, "if you hadn't found it, or had chosen to ignore it. But you did, and I didn't," Friedrich replied simply. And that made all the difference. Their legacy lived on not only in those they had directly saved, but in the example they set, proof that even in the darkest times, individual conscience and courage can prevail over systems designed to suppress humanity. Their story, passed down through generations, became a testament to how small acts of bravery can create ripples that extend far beyond what the actor might ever imagine. The coat itself, preserved with care, was eventually donated to a museum dedicated to documenting resistance efforts during the occupation. There, alongside other artifacts and testimonies, it continues to tell the story of Esther Goldstein, Friedrich Müller, and the network of individuals who chose compassion over compliance, humanity over hatred. The note that started it all, now yellowed with age but still legible, remains with their grandchildren, a tangible reminder that words written in desperate hope can sometimes find exactly the right reader, and that even in the midst of the world's most terrible conflicts, connections can form that transcend the artificial boundaries created to divide us. In the years before her passing in 1998, Esther often reflected on the seeming randomness of how her life had unfolded. That I should put a note in that particular coat, that it should find its way to that particular man, at that particular moment when his mind was open to receiving its message, what are the odds, she would ask. Yet it happened, and because it happened, so many lives were saved. It makes one wonder how many other small acts of courage might have changed history without us ever knowing. Friedrich, who lived until 2003, spent his final years speaking to students about moral choice and individual responsibility. It is easy, too easy, to surrender your judgment to a system, to say I was following orders, or this is simply how things are, he would tell them. The harder path, and the only one that allows you to live at peace with yourself, is to never abandon your own moral compass, even when the cost of following it seems impossibly high. Their story remains a powerful reminder of how the actions of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances can become beacons of hope that shine across decades, inspiring others to find their own courage when facing difficult choices. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.